I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would happen at an airport gate, surrounded by strangers rushing toward their own destinations while my world crumbled in Terminal B. My name is Rita. I'm 55 years old, and until 3 days ago, I believed that love, real, unconditional love, was enough to hold a family together. I was wrong. Standing there with my worn suitcase and the excitement I'd carried for months slowly draining from my body, I watched my only son, Daniel, hand me a return ticket with the same indifference he might show a cashier at a grocery store. No eye contact, no explanation, just cold, calculated dismissal wrapped in words that still echo in my mind. You'll learn a lesson. 27 years. That's how long I'd been Daniel's mother, his protector, his biggest supporter, and apparently his biggest disappointment. 27 years of sleepless nights when he was sick, of working double shifts at the hospital to pay for his college, of celebrating every achievement as if it were my own personal victory. 27 years of believing that the bond between a mother and child was unbreakable, sacred, permanent. The fluorescent lights above the departure gate buzzed with the same mechanical persistence I'd grown accustomed to during my nursing career. Harsh, constant, revealing everything in unforgiving detail. But instead of illuminating hospital corridors where I'd spent decades caring for other people's families, these lights exposed the moment when I realized my own family had become strangers. Daniel stood there in his expensive business suit, the one I'd helped him buy for his first job interview 3 years ago when he was still taking my calls, still saying, "I love you too, Mom," at the end of our conversations. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, his entire appearance crafted to project success and sophistication. He looked like the man I'd always dreamed he'd become, except for his eyes. Cold, distant, belonging to someone who'd learned to see me as an inconvenience rather than the woman who'd given him life. The airport moved around us in its endless rhythm of arrivals and departures, families reuniting with tears of joy, business people checking phones with practiced efficiency, elderly couples helping each other navigate wheelchairs and carry-on bags. Everyone had somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. A purpose that made sense. Everyone, except me. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the constant announcements echoing through the terminal. "I don't understand. I've been planning this trip for months. You invited me. You said it was time we spent some real time together, just the two of us." He looked at his watch. A gesture I recognized from his childhood, something he'd do when he was uncomfortable and wanted a conversation to end. The same way he'd acted when I'd try to discuss his grades, his friends, his future plans during those teenage years when every interaction felt like walking through a minefield of adolescent resentment. But this wasn't adolescent rebellion. This was deliberate cruelty from a grown man who'd somehow learned to weaponize silence against the woman who'd never used anything but love as her ammunition in their relationship. "The ticket's valid for the next flight," he said, his voice carrying that professional tone he used at work, the one that made it clear the conversation was over, and further discussion would be considered inappropriate. "Security will help you if you need directions. If you're enjoying this story and can relate to what Rita is going through, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps support our work. And comment which city you're watching from. It means so much to know our stories reach people everywhere." I clutched the return ticket, its edges already damp from my trembling fingers, and tried to process what was happening. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better communication. This wasn't a scheduling conflict or a family emergency that required me to postpone my visit. This was abandonment. Pure and calculated, delivered with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for longer than I could bear to imagine. The last time I'd seen Daniel in person was at his father's funeral 2 years ago. My husband, Robert, had died suddenly from a heart attack that gave us no time for goodbyes. No opportunity to resolve the tensions that had been building in our family since Daniel started his career abroad. Robert had always been the bridge between us. The translator who could somehow make Daniel understand my love without it feeling like pressure, make me understand Daniel's need for independence without it feeling like rejection. Without Robert, our phone calls had become increasingly brief and businesslike. Daniel would ask about my health, update me on his job promotions, mention his wife Sarah in passing, and always end with promises to visit soon that never materialized into actual plans. I'd started to worry that I was losing him the same way I'd lost Robert. Not through death, but through a slow fade that left me grasping at conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. So when Daniel called 3 months ago and suggested I come visit them, I'd felt like someone had thrown me a lifeline. "It's time, Mom," he'd said, his voice warmer than it had been in months. "Sarah and I have been talking, and we think it would be good for all of us if you came to stay for a few weeks. We've got plenty of space, and it would give us a chance to really spend time together." I'd cried after that phone call, tears of relief and anticipation that embarrassed me even in the privacy of my own kitchen. At 55, I was crying because my son wanted to see me. What did that say about how far our relationship had deteriorated? What did it say about how desperately I'd been missing the connection we'd once shared? I'd started planning immediately, using vacation days I'd been saving for years, researching flights and packing lists and gifts I could bring that wouldn't take up too much luggage space. I'd bought new clothes, not expensive ones, because my nurse's pension didn't allow for luxury, but clothes that made me feel put together, worthy of being seen with a successful son and his accomplished wife. The irony wasn't lost on me now, standing in this terminal with that careful outfit wrinkled from the long flight, and my optimism scattered across the departure gate floor like debris from a plane crash. I'd dressed for a reunion that was actually an execution, prepared for healing that was really designed to hurt. Daniel's phone buzzed and he glanced at it with the immediate attention he'd never given me during our conversation. Whatever message he'd received was apparently more important than watching his mother's face crumble in real time. More urgent than acknowledging that he'd just delivered devastating news with all the emotional investment of someone announcing train delays. "I have to go," he said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. "The gate agent can help you with your boarding pass when the time comes." And then he walked away. Not quickly, not with any visible urgency, just with the steady pace of someone who'd completed an unpleasant but necessary task and was ready to move on to more important matters. His figure disappeared into the crowd of travelers, and I was left standing alone with a suitcase full of gifts I'd never get to give and questions I'd never get to ask. The silence that followed his departure wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the presence of every word he'd chosen not to say, every explanation he'd decided I didn't deserve, every year of love I'd given that apparently hadn't earned me the courtesy of honesty about why I was no longer welcome in his life. The hours that followed felt like living in slow motion, while the world around me moved at normal speed. I found myself walking through the terminal corridors, past gates where other families were greeting each other with the kind of warmth I'd expected, but would never receive. My suitcase wheels clicked against the polished floor in a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Steady, but somehow wrong, like everything else about this day. I kept replaying our last real conversation from 3 months ago, searching for clues I might have missed. Daniel had sounded genuinely enthusiastic about my visit, talking about restaurants he wanted to take me to, places he thought I'd enjoy seeing. "Sarah's excited to spend time with you too," he'd said, and I'd felt such relief hearing those words. Sarah and I had only met twice, once at their wedding and once at Robert's funeral, but both times she'd been polite, if distant. I'd attributed her reserve to shyness, to the natural awkwardness of trying to connect with her husband's mother across different generations and life experiences. Now I wondered if every word of that invitation had been carefully calculated deception. Had they planned this humiliation together? Had Sarah been part of designing this lesson Daniel thought I needed to learn? The thought made my stomach clench with a different kind of pain. Not just the sharp ache of rejection, but the deeper, more insidious hurt that comes from realizing you've been naive about people you trusted completely. I sat down at one of those uncomfortable airport chairs that seemed designed to prevent anyone from staying too long and pulled out my phone to call Daniel. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe something had happened. A family emergency, a work crisis, that required him to send me home immediately, but didn't give him time to explain properly. Maybe the coldness I'd seen in his eyes was shock or stress, not the deliberate indifference it had appeared to be. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. His voice sounded warm and professional on the recording, Nothing like the stranger who'd handed me a return ticket with the emotional investment of someone returning a library book. I waited for the beep, then found myself struggling to find words that didn't sound desperate or pathetic. "Daniel, it's Mom. I'm still at the airport and I'm confused about what happened. Could you please call me back? I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding and I'd really like to talk to you about it. I love you." I hung up and immediately felt embarrassed by how small my voice had sounded, how the word please had carried the weight of 27 years of unconditional love reduced to begging for basic explanation. This was my son, the child I'd rocked to sleep through countless nights when he was sick, the teenager I'd driven to soccer practice and piano lessons and friends' houses without ever keeping score of the miles or the time. When had I become someone who needed to plead for his attention? An hour passed. No return call. I tried again. And this time the phone went straight to voicemail without ringing. He'd turned it off, or blocked my number. The technological equivalent of closing a door in my face and walking away. I looked around the terminal and noticed things I'd been too shocked to see earlier. There was an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed by a woman who looked to be his daughter, both of them laughing at something on her phone screen. A young mother was juggling 2 toddlers and a diaper bag while her husband bought coffee. Their chaos somehow looking like the most beautiful kind of disorder because it was shared, because they were in it together. And there was me, 55 years old, sitting alone in an airport with a suitcase full of gifts for a son who'd decided I was unworthy of even basic courtesy, let alone love. I'd become one of those people you see in public spaces and feel sorry for without really understanding their story. Someone obviously alone, obviously struggling, obviously not where they were supposed to be. The return ticket Daniel had given me was for a flight the next morning. 22 hours to kill in an airport, with no money for a hotel room, and no desire to spend what little cash I had on overpriced airport food when I wasn't even hungry. Grief, I'd learned during my nursing career, had a way of shutting down the body's basic needs, making food taste like cardboard, and sleep feel impossible, even when exhaustion should have made it inevitable. I decided to call Sarah. Maybe Daniel hadn't told her what he'd done. Maybe she was expecting me to arrive at their house and would be confused when I didn't show up. Maybe she could explain what lesson I was supposed to be learning from this carefully orchestrated humiliation. Sarah's phone also went to voicemail after several rings. Her voice was bright and cheerful on the recording, mentioning that she was probably busy with work or family time, and would get back to callers as soon as possible. Family time. The phrase felt like a physical blow, confirming what I'd been trying not to acknowledge, that I was no longer considered part of their family time, that whatever unit they'd formed together didn't include space for the woman who'd raised half of it. I left a message anyway, my voice steadier this time because anger was beginning to mix with the hurt, creating a combination that felt more sustainable than pure grief. "Sarah, this is Rita, Daniel's mother. I'm at the airport, and there seems to be some confusion about my visit. Could you please call me back when you get this message? Thank you." The terminal began to empty as evening approached. The last flights of the day were boarding, taking people home to dinners and families, and normal lives that continued in predictable patterns. The cleaning crews appeared with their carts and efficient movements, preparing to restore the space for tomorrow's travelers who would arrive with hope and purpose instead of rejection and confusion. I found myself watching these workers with the professional appreciation of someone who'd spent decades in healthcare, recognizing the skill required to maintain public spaces that thousands of people passed through daily. One woman, probably around my age, noticed me sitting in the same chair where I'd been for hours, and approached with the careful kindness of someone who'd seen every form of human distress that airports could produce. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked, her accent carrying traces of something Latin, her voice warm with genuine concern. "I've been working this terminal for 6 years, and you look like someone who's had a really hard day." For the first time since Daniel had walked away, someone was looking at me like I mattered, like my obvious distress was worth acknowledging instead of ignoring. I felt tears threatening again, but they were different tears. Not just grief, but gratitude for this stranger's willingness to see me as human, rather than as an inconvenience to be stepped around. "I'm supposed to be visiting my son," I said, my voice catching on the simple words that somehow contained the entire story of my life's biggest disappointment. But he changed his mind. He gave me a ticket home and left. The woman's face shifted into an expression I recognized from my own nursing days. The look of someone who'd witnessed enough human cruelty to be shocked by it, but not surprised. She glanced around to make sure her supervisor wasn't watching, then sat down in the chair next to mine with the movement of someone whose joints protested after long hours of physical labor. "My name's Carmen," she said. "And honey, I've got 4 kids of my own, and if any one of them ever treated me the way you just described, there wouldn't be enough apologies in the world to make it right." Hearing someone else say it, that what had happened to me was wrong, that Daniel's behavior was inexcusable rather than somehow justified by flaws in my character, felt like being given permission to feel angry instead of just ashamed. I'd been so focused on trying to understand what I'd done wrong that I hadn't allowed myself to consider that maybe the fault didn't lie with me at all. Carmen stayed with me for another hour, talking about her children and her work and the kinds of family drama she'd witnessed during her years at the airport. She didn't try to solve my problems or offer advice about what I should do next. She just sat with me in my pain, acknowledging that it was real and valid and worthy of witness. When her shift ended, she pressed a $20 bill into my hand despite my protests. "For food," she said firmly. "You can't think clearly when you're hungry, and you're going to need to think clearly to figure out what comes next." As she walked away, pushing her cleaning cart toward the employee areas I'd never see, I realized that this stranger had shown me more kindness in 1 hour than my own son had managed in what might be our final conversation. The contrast was devastating, but also clarifying, highlighting just how far from normal our relationship had drifted and just how much I'd been accepting behaviors that no one should have to tolerate from people who claim to love them. The night stretched endlessly before me like a punishment designed by someone who understood that physical discomfort was nothing compared to the torture of having too much time to think. I'd found a corner near the international gates where the lighting was dimmer and the foot traffic lighter, hoping to make myself invisible until morning came, and I could board the flight that would take me back to a life that suddenly felt as foreign as this airport terminal. Every few hours, security guards would make their rounds, their flashlights cutting through the semi-darkness like searchlights looking for people who didn't belong. I'd learned to sit up straighter when I saw them coming, to arrange my face into an expression that suggested I was simply an early traveler, waiting for a dawn departure rather than a woman who'd been abandoned by her own child with nowhere else to go. One guard, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Daniel, stopped at my makeshift camp around 3 in the morning. "Ma'am, are you waiting for a specific flight?" he asked, his tone professional but not unkind. I showed him my boarding pass for the morning flight home, and he nodded with the weary understanding of someone who'd seen every variety of travel disaster that airports could produce. "There's a chapel on the 2nd level if you need a quieter place to rest," he offered, and I almost laughed at the irony. A chapel. As if prayer could somehow explain why a son would choose cruelty over communication, why love could be so easily discarded when it became inconvenient. But I thanked him anyway, and made my way upstairs, my legs stiff from hours of sitting in chairs designed for temporary use rather than overnight residence. The chapel was small and non-denominational, with simple wooden pews and soft lighting that felt gentler than the harsh fluorescence that dominated the rest of the terminal. I wasn't particularly religious, but there was something comforting about the intentional quiet, the way the space seemed designed for contemplation rather than efficiency. I sat in the back row and let my mind wander through 27 years of memories, trying to identify the moment when my relationship with Daniel had shifted from love to obligation to this final, devastating rejection. When had I stopped being his mother and become his burden? When had my presence in his life transformed from something he valued to something he needed to escape? The early years had been so clear, so uncomplicated. Daniel as a toddler, climbing into my lap with picture books, and the absolute confidence that I would read to him for as long as he wanted to listen. Daniel at 10, proudly showing me school projects and sporting event ribbons, his face lighting up when I praised his efforts. Daniel at 16, sullen and challenging but still coming to me when his friends betrayed him or his heart got broken. still trusting that I would listen without judgment and offer comfort without conditions. Even during his college years, when independence became more important than family connection, he'd call home regularly, not just for money or practical advice, but for the simple pleasure of sharing his experiences with someone who celebrated his successes and sympathized with his struggles. When he'd gotten his first job offer, I was the second person he'd called, right after his girlfriend at the time. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," he'd said, his voice bubbling with excitement that made me feel like I was part of his triumph. Somewhere between that phone call and yesterday's cold dismissal, I'd lost him. Not gradually, the way children naturally separate from their parents as they build adult lives, but completely, as if someone had convinced him that cutting me out entirely was necessary for his happiness or success. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Sarah was involved in this decision, not because she was inherently cruel, but because she'd never had the chance to understand who I really was beyond the occasional awkward family gathering. To her, I was probably just Daniel's overprotective mother, someone whose emotional needs might compete with her marriage, whose presence might remind her husband of a simpler time before their sophisticated adult relationship. I'd tried so hard to be respectful of their marriage, to avoid the stereotypical mother-in-law behaviors that I'd heard women complain about at work. I'd never dropped by unannounced or offered unsolicited advice about their household management or career choices. I'd never criticized Sarah or made comparisons between her and the girlfriends Daniel had brought home during college. I'd been careful, perhaps too careful, to maintain appropriate boundaries while still expressing love and interest in their lives, but maybe my restraint had been interpreted as disinterest. Maybe Sarah thought I didn't care about their relationship because I wasn't constantly inserting myself into their business. Maybe Daniel had convinced himself that my respect for their independence was actually indifference, that my willingness to let them build their own life meant I didn't really want to be part of it. Or maybe the truth was simpler and more painful than I wanted to acknowledge. Maybe Daniel had simply outgrown his need for a mother. Maybe successful, sophisticated adults didn't want the complication of maintaining relationships with people who reminded them of less glamorous origins, who represented the ordinary struggles they'd worked so hard to transcend. I'd seen it happen to other women at work, nurses whose children became doctors and suddenly found their mothers' careers embarrassing, women whose sons married into wealthy families and began treating their backgrounds like shameful secrets to be hidden from new social circles. I'd always felt sorry for those women, while secretly believing that my relationship with Daniel was different, stronger, immune to that kind of class-based rejection. As dawn began to filter through the chapel's small windows, I realized I'd been crying quietly for hours without even noticing. My face felt tight with dried tears, and my throat ached from the effort of silent sobbing that had released some of the pressure building in my chest since Daniel walked away. The airport began to come alive around me as early morning flights prepared for departure. Business travelers hurried past with their efficient luggage and important destinations. Families gathered at gates with vacation excitement. Elderly couples helped each other navigate the complexities of modern air travel with the patient teamwork of people who'd been solving problems together for decades. I made my way to a restroom to clean up before my flight, splashing cold water on my face and trying to repair the damage that grief and sleeplessness had inflicted on my appearance. The woman looking back at me from the mirror seemed older than 55, worn down by more than just one night of airport sleeping. Her eyes held a sadness that looked permanent, the kind of disappointment that changes the shape of a person's face. But there was something else in her expression, too, a hardness that hadn't been there before, a steadiness that came from hitting bottom and discovering you could survive the impact. I'd spent the night grieving the loss of a relationship that had apparently been over long before I realized it was in danger. Now, I needed to figure out how to build a life that didn't depend on approval from someone who'd decided I wasn't worth basic human decency. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart jumped with hope that Daniel had reconsidered, that he'd realized the cruelty of what he'd done and wanted to make amends. But the message was from my neighbor back home, asking if I'd made it safely to Daniel's house and reminding me to send pictures of my trip. The innocent question felt like another small knife twist, highlighting how completely my expectations had been shattered. I'd been so excited about this visit that I'd told everyone, neighbors, co-workers, the clerk at my grocery store, about my plans to spend time with my son and daughter-in-law. I'd talked about the restaurants we might visit, the sights they'd show me, the way this trip might help bridge the growing distance between us. Now I had to figure out how to explain that none of it had happened, that my son had looked at me like I was a stranger he wanted to get rid of as quickly as possible. How do you tell people that your own child found you so objectionable that he couldn't tolerate your presence for even a single day? The boarding announcement for my flight home echoed through the terminal, and I gathered my suitcase with its unopened gifts and unused optimism. As I walked toward the gate, I passed families saying goodbye, couples planning reunions, children excited about visiting grandparents who would welcome them with open arms and endless patience. I'd been one of those welcoming grandmothers once, or at least I'd planned to be. I'd imagined Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, babysitting and birthday parties, the way love could multiply across generations instead of dying out when children decided their parents had become expendable. But as I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent and walked down the jetway toward the plane that would take me home to a life I now had to rebuild completely, I realized that some dreams were too fragile to survive the people they depended on. And some lessons, like the one Daniel thought he was teaching me, revealed more about the teacher than the student. The flight home felt like traveling backward through time, each mile taking me further from the future I'd imagined and closer to a present I no longer recognized. I sat in the middle seat between a businessman who worked on his laptop throughout the entire flight and a young woman who slept with her head against the window. And I envied both of them their ability to focus on anything other than the hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. When the plane touched down at my home airport, I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing it, as if the physical act of returning to familiar territory might somehow restore the sense of belonging I'd lost in a foreign terminal. But walking through the arrival gate surrounded by people being greeted by families and friends only emphasized how completely alone I was in this new reality Daniel had created for both of us. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was waiting for me as promised, her face bright with the kind of curiosity that comes from genuinely caring about other people's happiness. She'd volunteered to pick me up when I'd mentioned my travel plans months ago, and I'd been looking forward to sharing stories about my visit during the drive home. Now I had to figure out how to explain why I was returning after less than 24 hours with nothing to show for the trip, except puffy eyes and a suitcase full of gifts that would never be given. "Rita, how was your visit with Daniel?" she asked as I approached, her smile fading when she got a closer look at my face. "Honey, you look exhausted. Was the flight delayed?" I managed what I hoped was a convincing smile and gave her the explanation I'd been rehearsing during the plane ride. "There was a family emergency, so I had to come back early. Nothing serious, just one of those things that comes up unexpectedly." The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but it was easier than trying to explain the truth to someone whose own children called her every week and visited for holidays without being asked. Mrs. Patterson accepted my story with the polite restraint of someone who sensed there was more to hear, but didn't want to pry. During the drive to my house, she filled the silence with neighborhood news and updates about her grandchildren, treating me with the gentle consideration people show someone who's obviously struggling but doesn't want to discuss it. When she dropped me off at my front door, the house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 2 days earlier, but somehow felt different, smaller, quieter, like a place where someone used to live rather than a home where life was actively being lived. The plants I'd watered before leaving drooped slightly despite my careful preparations, and the mail had accumulated into a small pile that spoke of time passing without purpose or anticipation. I sat in my living room surrounded by the familiar furniture and photographs that had once felt like evidence of a life well lived, and tried to understand what came next. The house was paid for, a benefit of Robert's careful financial planning and life insurance that meant I didn't have to worry about losing my shelter the way some women my age did when their circumstances changed suddenly. My pension from the hospital was modest but adequate for basic needs, assuming I didn't have expensive tastes or unexpected emergencies. But financial security felt meaningless when measured against the emotional devastation of realizing that my most important relationship had been built on foundations I'd completely misunderstood. I'd spent 55 years believing that love was enough, that being a good mother and wife and friend and nurse would somehow protect me from the kind of casual cruelty I'd witnessed other people endure. I'd been naive in ways that now seemed almost embarrassing. The gifts I'd brought for Daniel and Sarah sat in my suitcase like archaeological evidence of my delusion. A scarf for Sarah in colors I'd thought would complement her complexion, chosen after an hour of careful consideration at a department store where I'd felt intimidated by the price tags, but determined to find something beautiful. A book for Daniel about the history of the city where he'd grown up, filled with photographs and stories I'd thought might help him remember happy times we'd shared before his life became too sophisticated for sentimentality. Looking at these items now, they seemed pathetic rather than thoughtful. The desperate offerings of someone trying to buy her way back into affection that had apparently never been as solid as she'd believed. I wondered if Daniel would have accepted them with polite distance, thanking me with the same tone he might use with a store clerk, or if he would have found excuses to refuse them entirely. The phone rang while I was sitting there surrounded by the debris of my shattered expectations, and I felt that familiar surge of hope followed immediately by disappointment when I saw it was my sister calling from 3 states away. Carol and I talked every few weeks, maintaining the kind of sisterly connection that felt dutiful rather than deeply intimate, and I wasn't ready to explain my humiliation to someone who might feel sorry for me, or, worse, might not be entirely surprised by Daniel's behavior. I let the call go to voicemail and listened to her cheerful message about wanting to hear about my trip with Daniel, how she hoped we were having wonderful weather and making beautiful memories together. Her voice sounded so normal, so innocent of the reality that families could implode without warning, that I almost called her back just to experience the comfort of talking to someone who still lived in a world where mothers and sons had uncomplicated relationships. But I wasn't ready for sympathy or advice or the well-meaning questions that would force me to relive every detail of my rejection. I wasn't ready to hear Carol's theories about what might have gone wrong, or her suggestions about how I might repair a relationship that Daniel had apparently decided wasn't worth maintaining. Instead, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since Robert's death. I opened a bottle of wine in the middle of the afternoon and sat in his chair, the recliner where he'd spent his last months reading newspapers and watching television programs that helped him forget about the heart condition that was slowly limiting his world. The chair still smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent I'd been afraid to wash away because it was one of the few physical reminders I had left of our 30-year marriage. The wine made everything feel slightly blurred around the edges, softening the sharp pain of rejection into something more manageable, more like sadness than devastation. I found myself talking to Robert as if he were still there, telling him about Daniel's coldness and asking him what I should have done differently, what signs I'd missed that might have prepared me for this outcome. He was always your favorite, I said to the empty chair, remembering how Daniel had run to his father with skinned knees and broken toys, how Robert had been the parent who could make everything better with patient explanations and gentle humor. Maybe if you were still here, he wouldn't have been able to just throw me away like this. Maybe you would have talked sense into him, but even as I said it, I wondered if Robert would have been just as powerless against whatever had turned our son into a stranger. Maybe the Daniel who could abandon his mother at an airport had been developing for years, growing more distant and judgmental while we were too busy being proud of his success to notice that he was learning to see us as obstacles to overcome, rather than people who loved him unconditionally. The afternoon dissolved into evening, while I sat there with my wine and my regrets, watching the light fade outside the windows and feeling like I was disappearing along with it. For the first time since Robert's death, I understood why some people simply gave up when life became too difficult to navigate alone. It wasn't weakness or selfishness. It was the rational response to discovering that everything you'd built your identity around could be taken away by people who'd never valued it as much as you'd believed they did. But somewhere in the darkness that settled over my house and my heart, something else began to take shape. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more durable. A recognition that I'd survived worse losses than this, and somehow kept functioning. I'd buried my husband and my parents, endured the deaths of patients I'd cared about, navigated the disappointments and betrayals that come with 5 decades of adult life. Daniel's rejection felt like the end of everything because I'd made the mistake of putting all my emotional eggs in one basket, of believing that being his mother was the most important thing about my identity. But I'd been other things too. A nurse who'd comforted dying patients and their families. A wife who'd supported her husband through career changes and health problems. A neighbor who'd helped people during emergencies and celebrations alike. Maybe it was time to remember who Rita was beyond her relationship to a son who'd decided she wasn't worth basic human decency. Maybe this devastating lesson Daniel thought he was teaching me was actually an opportunity to discover what was left when you stripped away the roles other people had defined for you. I still had something he'd forgotten to take into account when he'd planned his cruel dismissal. I still had myself, and I was stronger than either of us had realized. The weeks that followed my return moved like a slow-motion film where I was both the actor and the audience, watching myself go through the motions of normal life while something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. I returned to work at the clinic where I'd been doing part-time nursing since my retirement from the hospital, and my colleagues welcomed me back with the casual warmth of people who assumed my trip had been everything I'd hoped it would be. "How was your visit with your son?" Dr. Martinez asked during my first shift back, his genuine interest making me realize I'd have to perfect my lie about the family emergency or risk having to tell this story dozens more times to well-meaning people who cared about my happiness. "It was good to see him," I managed, which was technically true, even though seeing him had destroyed something inside me that I wasn't sure could be repaired. Different than I expected, but good. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised my coworkers and probably worried them too. I volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late to complete paperwork that could have waited until the next day, and found myself gravitating toward the most difficult patients, the ones who were angry about their circumstances, frightened about their diagnoses, or simply too overwhelmed by medical bureaucracy to navigate their treatment plans effectively. Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old woman recovering from a stroke that had left her partially paralyzed and completely furious about her new limitations, became my unofficial specialty. Other nurses found her demanding and ungrateful, but I recognized something in her rage that felt familiar. The bewilderment of someone whose life had been changed without her consent, who was being asked to accept circumstances she'd never chosen and couldn't understand. "They keep telling me I should be grateful," she said one afternoon while I helped her with physical therapy exercises that exhausted her, but might eventually restore some of her independence. "Grateful that I survived, grateful that my mind still works, grateful that my children visit me every week. But nobody asks if I wanted to survive like this." I understood her anger in ways that had nothing to do with medical training and everything to do with recent experience. "You don't have to be grateful," I told her, surprising us both with the firmness in my voice. "You can be angry and sad and disappointed, and that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human." Something in my tone must have conveyed more than professional sympathy, because Mrs. Chen looked at me with the sharp attention of someone who recognized a fellow traveler in the landscape of unwanted change. "What happened to you?" she asked, her directness cutting through the careful professional boundaries I usually maintained with patients. For a moment, I considered telling her the truth about Daniel's rejection, about the way my understanding of my own life had been shattered in an airport terminal, about the daily effort required to keep functioning when everything you'd believed about love and family had been revealed as naive fantasy. But instead, I helped her adjust her position in the chair and redirected our conversation back to her recovery plan. That evening, though, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Chen's question in ways that went beyond her specific situation. What had happened to me? The obvious answer was that my son had rejected me cruelly and without explanation. But the deeper truth was more complicated. I'd discovered that I'd been living in a version of reality that didn't match the actual circumstances of my relationships, and now I had to figure out how to build a new understanding of my life based on what was actually true rather than what I'd wanted to believe. I started taking different routes home from work, walking through neighborhoods I'd never explored before, and noticing details that had been invisible when my life had felt predictable and secure. There was a community garden where people of all ages worked together to grow vegetables and flowers. their easy collaboration suggesting the kind of purposeful connection I'd been missing since Robert's death. There was a bookstore with a coffee shop attached, where people sat alone reading or writing in journals, looking content in their solitude rather than lonely. One evening, I stopped at this bookstore and bought a notebook. Nothing fancy, just a simple composition book like the ones Daniel had used for school assignments when he was young. I told myself I was going to use it for grocery lists and appointment reminders, but what I actually wrote that first night surprised me. I am 55 years old, I wrote, and I don't know who I am when I'm not taking care of someone else. The sentence sat there on the page like a confession I hadn't meant to make, revealing something I'd been avoiding since Robert's death, and Daniel's increasing distance had left me without clear roles to fill. For 30 years, I'd been Robert's wife, managing our household and supporting his career and sharing the daily negotiations that marriage requires. For 27 years, I'd been Daniel's mother, first in the all-consuming way that small children demand, then in the background way that teenagers and young adults need, then in the increasingly peripheral way that successful adult children allow. But who was Rita when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people? What did she want that had nothing to do with making someone else happy? What dreams had she set aside during the decades when other people's needs had taken priority over her own desires? I'd become a nurse because I was good at taking care of people and because it provided stable employment with reasonable benefits. But I'd never really considered whether it was work that fulfilled me or just work that I could do competently. I'd married Robert because I loved him and because he was kind and reliable, but I'd never thought about what kind of life I might have built if I'd remained single or married someone completely different. The notebook became my evening companion, a place where I could explore thoughts and feelings that had no audience except myself. I wrote about my childhood, trying to remember the girl I'd been before I'd learned to define myself through other people's approval. I wrote about my nursing career, identifying moments when I'd felt truly useful and engaged, rather than just professionally competent. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The times when I'd felt most like myself, most alive and purposeful, had been moments when I was solving problems, helping people navigate difficult situations, providing practical support during crises, not just medical crises, but life crises. The families of terminal patients who needed someone to explain what the dying process would look like. New mothers who were overwhelmed by the gap between what they'd expected parenthood to feel like and what they were actually experiencing. Elderly patients who were frightened by their increasing dependence and needed someone to listen to their fears without trying to minimize them. I'd been good at those conversations because I'd learned early in life that most people didn't need their problems solved as much as they needed their experiences validated. They needed someone to witness their struggle and reflect back that their feelings made sense, that their responses were normal, that they weren't failing at being human just because life had become more difficult than they'd anticipated. Maybe Daniel's lesson, the one he thought I needed to learn about boundaries or expectations or whatever had motivated his cruelty, was actually teaching me something entirely different. Maybe I'd been so focused on maintaining my relationship with him that I'd forgotten how to maintain my relationship with myself. Maybe the love I'd been offering him had become desperate and needy because I'd stopped cultivating other sources of meaning and connection. It wasn't an excuse for what he'd done. Nothing could justify the deliberate heartlessness of abandoning someone at an airport without explanation. But it was a recognition that I'd been putting all my emotional energy into one relationship that had been weakening for reasons I'd refused to acknowledge. And now I had the opportunity to distribute that energy in ways that might be more sustainable and fulfilling. 1 month after my disastrous trip, I was working a late shift when Carmen appeared at the clinic reception desk, looking as surprised to see me as I was to see her. She was there with her elderly mother, who'd fallen and needed x-rays to determine whether her wrist was broken or just badly sprained. "Rita," she said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I've been thinking about you since that night at the airport. How are you doing? Did things work out with your son?" The question should have been painful, but somehow it wasn't. Instead of feeling shame about my situation, I felt gratitude for her concern and curiosity about why this woman who barely knew me had continued to carry my story in her thoughts. Not the way I hoped. I told her honestly, but maybe the way I needed them to. I'm learning some things about myself that I probably should have figured out years ago. Carmen nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if personal growth often came disguised as personal disaster. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be gifts we didn't know we needed, she said, then paused and smiled. My grandmother used to say that, and I always thought it was just something old people told themselves to feel better about bad luck. But now I think, maybe she was onto something. As I helped process her mother's paperwork and made sure they understood the follow-up care instructions, I realized something had shifted in the way I moved through the world. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for Daniel to apologize, not for my life to return to some previous state of security, not for someone else to define my value and purpose. For the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Not because someone else needed me to be there, but because I'd chosen to be there. The difference was subtle but profound. The difference between being needed and being useful, between serving others out of desperation and serving others out of strength. I still had something Daniel had overlooked when he'd tried to teach me my place in his world. I had myself, and I was just beginning to discover what that actually meant. 3 months had passed since that devastating day at the airport, and I'd settled into a rhythm of life that felt foreign but increasingly sustainable. My journal had become thicker, filled with observations about patients, reflections on memories I'd never properly examined, and tentative plans for a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. I was learning to be alone without being lonely, to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and quiet moments that belonged entirely to me. Then Carmen called. I was surprised to hear from her. We'd exchanged phone numbers during her mother's clinic visit, but I hadn't expected our connection to extend beyond that brief professional encounter. Her voice carried an excitement that was almost breathless, as if she'd been running or had just received incredible news. Rita, you need to see something, she said without preamble. I'm sending you a link right now. Check your email and call me back immediately. I opened my laptop, curiosity overriding my usual caution about unexpected digital communications. Carmen had sent me a link to a local news website with a subject line that made my stomach drop. Viral video. Son abandons mother at airport. Below that, in smaller text, security footage sparks outrage as online community rallies behind mistreated woman. My hands began to shake as I clicked the link, and suddenly I was watching myself from an aerial perspective. Grainy security camera footage that captured the entire scene of Daniel handing me the return ticket and walking away. The timestamp showed it was from that terrible day, and someone had edited the footage to include captions explaining what was happening. Son gives mother return ticket. Mother tries to call him. Mother left alone at gate. The article below the video was brief but devastating in its accuracy. Someone, probably an airport employee who'd witnessed the scene, had submitted the footage to a local news station with a tip about the cruelest thing I've ever seen a son do to his mother. The story had been picked up by social media, where it had gone viral with thousands of comments from people expressing outrage, sympathy, and their own stories of family betrayal and abandonment. But it wasn't just the video that made me feel like the world had tilted off its axis. The article included a quote from Daniel, obtained when a reporter had somehow tracked him down for comment. His response was worse than his original cruelty, more revealing of his character than anything he could have said to my face. My mother has boundary issues, he was quoted as saying. She's never learned to respect that I have my own life now. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way, and maybe this will teach her that she can't just insert herself into my family whenever she feels like it. I was protecting my wife and our privacy. Reading those words felt like being stabbed and then having the knife twisted slowly to maximize the damage. Boundary issues. As if 27 years of loving someone unconditionally was somehow a violation of their personal space. As if accepting his invitation to visit was inserting myself into his life rather than responding to his direct request for my presence. But what made it even worse was the phrase "my family," as if I was somehow external to his family, rather than the person who'd created it, raised him, made every sacrifice necessary to ensure he had the opportunities that led to his current success. In Daniel's version of reality, I was an intrusion to be managed rather than a mother who deserved basic respect and consideration. The comments section below the article was enormous, filled with responses from people who seemed more angry about Daniel's behavior than I'd been able to allow myself to be. Strangers were defending me with a fierceness that was both gratifying and overwhelming. "This is disgusting," one person had written. "I would give anything to have my mother back, and this man throws his away like garbage." Boundary issues? "The only boundary issue here is his complete lack of basic human decency," another commenter had posted. "Someone should start a GoFundMe to send this woman on a real vacation where she's treated with the respect she deserves," suggested a third. But it was the personal stories that really undid me. Comment after comment from people sharing their own experiences with ungrateful children, with family members who'd turned successful and decided their origins were embarrassing, with the particular pain that comes from loving someone who finds that love burdensome rather than precious. One woman had written, "My son did something similar when he married into money. Suddenly, my working-class background was shameful to him. I spent years blaming myself before I realized the problem wasn't with me. It was with him." To the woman in this video, "You deserve so much better." I called Carmen back with tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of relief, of validation, of the overwhelming gratitude that comes from having your reality confirmed by people who had no reason to lie to you or protect your feelings. "Rita, honey, the whole world can see what really happened," Carmen said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your son can spin it however he wants, but everyone with eyes can see who the real problem is in this situation." Over the following days, the story continued to grow. More news outlets picked it up, social media exploded with discussions about adult children who abandon their parents, and somehow my email address was discovered and shared, leading to hundreds of messages from strangers offering support, sharing similar stories, and expressing outrage on my behalf. The attention was overwhelming but also oddly healing. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I'd somehow misunderstood the situation or failed to recognize legitimate grievances Daniel might have had. But seeing the universal horror at his behavior confirmed what my heart had known all along, that what he'd done was inexcusable regardless of whatever rationalizations he'd constructed to justify it. More importantly, the response revealed something about the world that I'd forgotten during my darkest moments. There were good people everywhere, people who still believed that mothers deserved better than casual cruelty from their children, people who understood that family relationships required basic decency even when they became complicated or strained. A week after the story broke, I received a call from a producer at a national morning show who wanted to interview me about the experience. The idea terrified me. I'd never imagined myself as someone worthy of television attention, but something in her approach made me consider it. She wasn't interested in sensationalizing my pain or creating dramatic confrontation with Daniel. She wanted to talk about the broader issue of how families navigate changing relationships, how adult children can maintain independence while still treating their parents with respect. "Your story has resonated with so many people," she explained, "because it's not really about one terrible son. It's about a culture that sometimes teaches successful people they can discard the relationships that helped create their success. You've become a symbol of something a lot of people are experiencing, but don't feel comfortable talking about." I agreed to the interview, partly because I wanted Daniel to see that his lesson had backfired spectacularly, but mostly because I'd received so many messages from women in similar situations who felt isolated and ashamed of their children's behavior. If sharing my story could help other people feel less alone with their pain, then maybe some good could come from this nightmare. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and as the date approached, I found myself experiencing something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with taking care of other people's immediate needs, and everything to do with using my experience to create positive change in the world. Daniel had tried to teach me that I was disposable, that my love was worthless, that my place in his life was whatever scraps of attention he chose to give me. But his lesson had taught me something entirely different, that I had value independent of his approval, that my story mattered to people I'd never met, that surviving his cruelty with dignity was its own form of strength. For the first time since that terrible day at the airport, I wasn't just surviving the aftermath of his rejection. I was preparing to transform it into something that could help other people heal from similar wounds. I wasn't just the victim of his lesson anymore. I was about to become the teacher of my own. The phone calls from reporters continued, but so did the calls from women who'd seen their own stories reflected in mine. And in those conversations, something remarkable was happening. I was discovering that helping other people process their pain was helping me understand my own worth in ways that had nothing to do with Daniel's opinion of me. I was still Rita, the woman who'd been abandoned at an airport by her own son. But I was also becoming Rita, the woman who'd refused to let that abandonment define her value. And for the first time in months, I was genuinely curious about what that version of myself might be capable of accomplishing. The morning of the television interview, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing the navy blue dress I'd bought for special occasions. Weddings, graduations, important events that required me to look respectable and composed. The woman looking back at me seemed different from the one who'd been abandoned at that airport 4 months earlier. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression carrying a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. The producers had sent a car to bring me to the studio, a luxury that felt surreal, but also somehow appropriate. I'd spent so many years making do with whatever transportation was cheapest or most convenient, and there was something powerful about being treated like someone whose time and comfort mattered enough to warrant special consideration. Carmen had offered to come with me for moral support, but I'd declined, realizing that this was something I needed to do alone. Not because I was trying to prove my independence, but because I'd discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company in ways I'd never experienced before. The woman who was nervous but determined about this interview was someone I was proud to be, someone whose story deserved to be heard regardless of how Daniel felt about the exposure. The studio was smaller than I'd expected, but more professional, with cameras and lights arranged around a comfortable seating area that looked like someone's tastefully decorated living room. The host, Jennifer Walsh, greeted me with the kind of warmth that seemed genuine rather than manufactured, and spent several minutes helping me feel comfortable before the cameras started rolling. "I want you to know," she said, "that we've received thousands of responses to the announcement about this interview. People are rooting for you, Rita. Your story has touched something deep in a lot of families." When the interview began, I felt that familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was different from the anxiety I'd experienced during medical emergencies or family crises. This was the nervousness of someone who had something important to say and wanted to say it well, not the fear of someone trying to avoid making mistakes or causing problems. "Rita," Jennifer began, "for people who haven't seen the viral video, can you tell us what happened at that airport?" I took a breath and told the story simply, without dramatization or self-pity, focusing on the facts rather than my emotional response. But when I reached the part about Daniel's public statement, something in my voice must have changed. Because Jennifer leaned forward with the attention of someone who recognized the moment when polite conversation became something more significant. "Your son said publicly that you have boundary issues, and that this was a lesson you needed to learn. How do you respond to that?" For a moment, I felt the old impulse to defend him, to find ways to explain his behavior that didn't make him look as cruel as his actions suggested. But then I remembered all the messages I'd received from women who'd spent years making excuses for children who treated them poorly, and I realized that protecting Daniel from the consequences of his choices wasn't my job anymore. "Jennifer," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I think when someone abandons their mother at an airport and then tells the world she deserved it, the person with boundary issues isn't the mother." The studio fell silent for a moment, and I could see the cameramen exchanging glances that suggested this wasn't the kind of careful, diplomatic response they usually heard from guests who were discussing family conflicts. "I spent months wondering what I'd done wrong," I continued, "because that's what mothers do. We blame ourselves when our children hurt us. But the truth is, I didn't do anything wrong by accepting his invitation to visit. I didn't do anything wrong by loving him unconditionally for 27 years. And I didn't do anything wrong by expecting basic human decency from someone I'd sacrificed everything to support and protect." Jennifer nodded encouragingly, and I found myself saying things I'd been thinking but hadn't fully articulated even to myself. I think there's something happening in our culture where success gives people permission to discard the relationships that helped create that success. My son worked hard for his achievements, but he didn't get there alone. I worked double shifts to pay for his education. I drove him to every practice and lesson and social event. I celebrated every victory and helped him through every disappointment. And when he decided that acknowledging those contributions was inconvenient for his new life, he chose cruelty over gratitude. The words were flowing now, not with anger, but with the clarity that comes from finally understanding something you've been struggling to comprehend. But what really breaks my heart isn't what he did to me, I said, surprising myself with this realization. It's what he did to himself. He turned himself into the kind of person who can look at love and see it as a burden. He turned himself into someone who thinks showing basic kindness to his mother is somehow beneath him. That's not success. That's tragedy. After the interview, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The show's social media accounts filled with comments from viewers sharing their own stories, thanking me for speaking honestly about family dynamics that too many people suffered through in silence. But the most significant response came 3 days later, when I received a phone call from a number I recognized but hadn't expected to hear from ever again. Mom. Daniel's voice was different, smaller somehow, lacking the confident coldness he'd displayed at the airport. I saw the interview. For months I'd imagined this moment, scripted conversations where I might get to express my hurt, or demand explanations, or try to rebuild what he'd destroyed. But now that he was actually on the phone, I felt only a calm curiosity about what he might say. "And?" I asked, my tone neutral. "I didn't realize it had been recorded," he said. And I almost laughed at the revelation that his remorse was motivated by exposure rather than genuine recognition of wrongdoing. "The security cameras, you mean? I didn't know it would go viral. I didn't know people would react like this." "How did you think people would react, Daniel?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When you told the world your mother had boundary issues and needed to learn a lesson, what response were you expecting?" There was a long pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried the first hint of uncertainty I'd heard from him in years. I thought people would understand." Sarah said, "We thought..." "Ah," I said, finally understanding the dynamic I'd been missing. "Sarah was involved in planning this. She didn't think it was a good idea for you to visit," he admitted. "She said your last phone calls had been too emotional, that you were becoming too dependent on me since Dad died. She thought if I was firm about boundaries, you'd understand that our relationship needed to change." The pieces were falling into place, not in a way that excused his behavior, but in a way that explained how a son I'd raised to be kind could have convinced himself that cruelty was justified. Someone he trusted more than his own mother had convinced him that my love was actually manipulation, that my grief over losing him was really an inappropriate attempt to control his life. "Daniel," I said, "did you ever consider having an adult conversation with me about whatever concerns you had? Did it occur to you that I might have been willing to respect whatever boundaries you needed if you'd explained them honestly instead of ambushing me at an airport?" We didn't think you'd listen. You didn't give me the chance to listen. You decided I was the problem and planned a punishment without ever telling me what I was supposedly doing wrong." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel offering explanations that sounded more like excuses and apologies, that felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. By the end, I realized that the son I'd been grieving was probably gone forever, replaced by someone who'd learned to see love as a liability and family obligations as burdens to be managed, rather than relationships to be treasured. But something unexpected had happened during our conversation. Instead of feeling devastated by the confirmation that he'd actively planned my humiliation, I felt relieved. Not because the situation was resolved, it clearly wasn't, but because I finally understood that his behavior wasn't really about me at all. It was about choices he'd made about what kind of person he wanted to be. And those choices had led him to become someone I might not even like if I met him as a stranger. "I'm going to let you go now, Daniel," I said when he started repeating himself about lessons and boundaries and misunderstandings. "If you ever decide you want to have a real relationship with me, one based on mutual respect rather than your need to manage my emotions, my door is open." But I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left begging for scraps of affection from someone who sees my love as a problem to be solved. After I hung up, I sat in my living room feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because we'd reconciled, we clearly hadn't, but because I'd finally stopped waiting for him to give me permission to value myself. The interview had shown me that my story mattered to people beyond my family, that my experience could help others heal from similar wounds, that my voice had power even when the people I'd thought mattered most weren't willing to listen to it. The woman who'd been abandoned at that airport had been someone who defined herself entirely through her relationships to other people. But the woman who'd just finished that phone call was someone who'd learned that her worth existed independent of anyone else's ability to recognize it. 6 months after that transformative television interview, I was standing in the lobby of a hotel in Denver, waiting to speak at a conference about family relationships and aging. The invitation had come from a nonprofit organization that worked with older adults who'd been estranged from their children, and when they'd asked me to share my story as part of a panel discussion, I'd accepted without hesitation. The woman looking back at me from the lobby's mirrored walls bore little resemblance to the broken person who'd been abandoned at an airport less than a year earlier. She wore a confident expression, and clothes chosen for comfort rather than to please someone else's expectations. Her gray hair, which I'd been coloring for years to appear younger and more appealing, now grew in its natural silver that caught the light beautifully and suggested wisdom earned through experience rather than youth desperately preserved. The months following my interview had been filled with opportunities I'd never imagined. A publisher had approached me about writing a memoir, not because my story was unique, but because it was tragically common. Thousands of parents were experiencing similar rejection from adult children who decided that success required discarding their origins. A literary agent explained that there was a hunger for honest conversations about these family dynamics, stories that didn't end with forced reconciliation, but with authentic healing. The book was scheduled for publication the following spring, and writing it had been both painful and liberating. Revisiting my relationship with Daniel chronologically had revealed patterns I'd been too close to see while living through them. His gradual withdrawal that had begun years before Sarah entered the picture, my increasing desperation to maintain connection as he became more successful, the way I'd enabled his dismissive behavior by always being the one to reach out, to apologize, to accommodate his schedule and preferences. But more importantly, writing had helped me rediscover aspects of myself that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother or wife. I'd written about my nursing career with pride, instead of the apologetic tone I'd used when Daniel made it clear he was embarrassed by my working-class profession. I'd explored my childhood dreams, my love of reading and gardening, my satisfaction in helping people navigate difficult transitions, my unexpected talent for public speaking that had emerged during various book events and interviews. The conference organizers had paired me with Dr. Sarah Chen, a family therapist who specialized in adult parent-child relationships, and together we'd been speaking to audiences across the country about the difference between healthy boundaries and emotional abandonment. Dr. Chen provided the clinical perspective while I offered the lived experience. And our presentations had apparently helped thousands of people understand that loving someone didn't require accepting mistreatment from them. The hardest lesson for many parents, I'd learned to tell audiences, is that we can't love our children enough to change them into the people we hoped they'd become. We can only love them enough to model what healthy relationships look like. And if they choose something different, that's information about their character, not a reflection of our worth as parents. The words always felt strange coming out of my mouth, because they represented such a complete reversal of everything I'd believed about maternal love and family loyalty. But they were true in ways I was still discovering, and saying them publicly helped reinforce their reality in my own heart. After my presentation in Denver, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and a story that had become painfully familiar. Her successful son had gradually excluded her from his life after marrying someone who viewed his mother's working-class background as an embarrassment. She'd been blaming herself for years, wondering what she'd done wrong, how she could repair a relationship that her son seemed determined to keep at arm's length. "I've been making excuses for him," she said, her voice breaking. "Telling myself that he's just busy, that his wife needs time to adjust to our family, that if I'm patient enough and understanding enough, He'll remember how much he used to love me. I handed her tissues and listened to her pour out years of accumulated pain, recognizing in her words the same desperate hope I'd carried for so long. When she finished, I shared something I'd learned during my own healing process. The love you gave him wasn't wasted, I told her. It made him into someone capable of success and happiness, even if he's chosen to forget that. But now you need to take that same love and give it to someone who will appreciate it, starting with yourself. She looked at me with the expression of someone hearing a foreign language that somehow made perfect sense. And I realized this was why I'd been willing to make my private pain public. Not for revenge against Daniel or Sarah, not to prove I'd been wronged, but to help other women understand that their children's inability to value their love didn't diminish the love's worth. The speaking engagements had led to other opportunities that surprised me with their perfect fit for skills I'd developed over decades of nursing and mothering. I'd been invited to join the board of a nonprofit that provided support services for isolated elderly people, many of whom had been abandoned by family members who found their aging parents inconvenient or burdensome. Working with these seniors reminded me daily that Daniel's rejection of me was part of a larger cultural problem, a society that had somehow decided that loyalty and gratitude were optional, that success meant leaving behind the people who'd helped create it. But it also showed me how resilient human beings could be when they stopped waiting for other people's approval and started building lives based on their own values and interests. Carmen had become one of my closest friends, our bond forged in that airport terminal and strengthened through months of honest conversation about family disappointment and personal reinvention. She'd encouraged me to take Spanish lessons, something I'd always wanted to do but had never prioritized when my time was consumed by other people's needs. Learning a new language at 56 felt like proof that my brain still had room for growth, that my future could contain experiences I'd never imagined for myself. The woman I was becoming surprised me regularly with her opinions and preferences and capabilities. She enjoyed traveling alone, discovering that she could navigate new cities and cultures without someone else's guidance or approval. She'd developed friendships with people from completely different backgrounds, relationships based on shared interests rather than family obligation or professional necessity. She'd learned to cook for one person in ways that felt celebratory rather than sad, creating meals that pleased her own taste rather than accommodating someone else's preferences. Most importantly, she'd stopped waiting, not for Daniel to apologize or for Sarah to change her mind or for some future version of events that would restore her to the family she'd thought she belonged to. She'd accepted that the relationship she'd treasured was over, and had used that acceptance as the foundation for building something entirely new. Daniel had called twice more since our conversation after the interview, both times when my story appeared in major media outlets and apparently caused him embarrassment in his professional circles. His approach remained the same: minimal acknowledgement of wrongdoing combined with requests that I stop talking publicly about our situation because it was affecting his reputation and his marriage. I'd listened politely and declined his requests with the same calm dignity I'd learned to bring to all my interactions with him. "Daniel," I'd said during our last conversation, "you chose to make this situation public when you decided to humiliate me in an airport and then justify it to reporters. I'm simply telling my side of the story you started. If you don't like how it reflects on you, perhaps you should consider changing your behavior rather than asking me to hide the consequences of it." The silence that followed had been different from his usual calculated coldness. It was the silence of someone who'd finally understood that the person he was trying to manipulate had moved beyond his ability to hurt or control. Now, standing in this hotel lobby preparing for another speaking engagement, I realized that Daniel's cruel lesson had indeed taught me something valuable, just not what he'd intended. He'd tried to teach me that I was disposable, that my love was worthless, that my place in the world was whatever scraps others chose to give me. Instead, he taught me that I was stronger than I'd known, that my voice mattered to people I'd never met, that my story could help others heal from wounds similar to my own. I'd learned that sometimes the worst betrayals become unexpected gifts, forcing us to discover resources and capabilities we never knew we possessed. I'd learned that dignity wasn't something other people could take away. It was something you chose to maintain regardless of how others chose to treat you. But most importantly, I'd learned that love didn't die when it wasn't returned. It simply found new places to grow, new ways to flourish, new purposes to serve. The love I'd poured into Daniel for 27 years hadn't disappeared when he decided he didn't want it. It had transformed into something larger and more meaningful, touching the lives of strangers who needed to hear that they mattered, that their pain was valid, that their worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. As I walked toward the conference room where several hundred people waited to hear my story, I carried with me the knowledge that had saved my life. Sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply end up teaching us the most important lessons about our own strength. And sometimes the silence that feels like abandonment is actually the space where we finally learn to hear our own voice clearly. I was 56 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defined by my relationships to other people. I was simply Rita, a woman who'd survived betrayal and discovered that survival could look like triumph, that healing could become a form of service, that the love others rejected could be transformed into something the world desperately needed. Daniel had tried to teach me my place. Instead, he'd taught me my worth, and that lesson, unlike his, would last a lifetime.